Hello, everyone. Nice to see many friendly faces and well-known names on the screen. I think I'll wait just a few minutes to let uh, people who are slow to get registered get into the event. Uh, so we'll hang loose until the moment comes. People are still connecting, so it's good to wait a bit longer. Maybe we'll wait one more minute because we all know how tricky it can sometimes be to get into the event you want to get into. Your computer gives you trouble or whatever. Well, all right, let us begin. Um, my name is Fred Donner. I'm now a retired faculty member from the University of Chicago, Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations and the Oriental Institute, and once was director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, and I'm glad to welcome you all to this uh, lecture in the Friday lecture series, the Farouk Mustafa Memorial Friday lecture series, where we are very pleased to have as our speaker uh, Professor Malika Dekkiche from the University of Antwerp, and Department of History at the University of Antwerp in Belgium. Uh, Professor Dekkiche studied in her hometown of Liège in Belgium, where she worked with the eminent scholar of the Mamluks, Professor Frederick Bowden. During the course of her doctoral studies, Professor Bowden suggested that she come to Chicago for a time to do some research here, to sort of, shall we say, hang out in the orbit of some of the scholars at Chicago, a renowned center for Mamluk studies, especially since she was working on the Mamluks. And in particular, she came for several months and worked closely with Professor John Woods, who, since she was working on relations between the Mamluks and other states, especially states in Iran, uh, it was good to work with Professor Woods, who, of course, is extremely knowledgeable about the post-Mongol states of Iran. So she's no stranger to Chicago, and even more so, she went back to Belgium after some time here and she finished her PhD, which no mean feat because the timeline in Europe for doing dissertations is very tight. You have to finish very quickly, and she did. And then she applied for and won a fellowship from something called the Belgian American Educational Foundation, which none of us had ever heard of, but which provides postdoc funding for Belgian scholars to come to the United States. And she got one of these fellowships, which usually they go to like nuclear physicists and medical doctors and so on. Well, she won one to come here again for a year in this case to work on especially the relations between the Mamluks and states in Iran, working again closely with Professor Woods. Um, so we have known Malika very well, some of us, and it's a real pleasure to have her back. We wish you could be here in person rather than on screen, but it's great to have you this way, at least. After her second visit here, she went back to Belgium. She was for a couple of years on a postdoctoral position at the University of Ghent, and then she was hired by the history department at the University of Antwerp, I guess in a tenure track position at the time, but now she is a secure tenured professor there, so and we're very happy for that. She's the co-editor of a volume which appeared 2 years ago called Mamluk Cairo, a Crossroad for Embassies, very much in the framework of what she works on diplomatic history of the Mamluks and other states. that appeared in 2019 from E.J. Brill. And her next book, currently in the works with the University of Edinburgh Press, is entitled Keeping the Peace in Pre-Modern Islam. Malika, welcome back. We look forward to your talk, which is called A World of Kings and Realms.
Thank you very much, Fred, for the really nice introduction, and thank you very much to you and to Thomas and to the Center for having me. I would, yeah, of course, have much preferred to be there back with you in Chicago and Hyde Park, but nevertheless, it's nice to see some of you now on the screen and hopefully, yeah, soon again in the real world. Let me first share the screen so I can turn to the PowerPoint, because there will be a couple of slides I may be interested to you. Do you all see now the PowerPoint? Yep, okay, perfect. Okay, so let's go. So today I'm going to present my ongoing project that more or less is yeah, an updated version of the book I'm working on, which Fred has just presented, originally entitled Keeping the Peace in Premodern Islam. But as the year went, the project evolved and the title as well. And so, but I'm going to present two parts of this project that is, in fact, fully entitled now, A World of Realms, of Kings and of Men, which build up on my previous research on Mamluk and Islamic diplomacy. But in fact, rather than looking at diplomacy there as a mere object of study, it instead uses it as an analytical frame that allows me to investigate various set of practices of elite communication and of relationship between political elite. So doing so, the project is constructed around three different, but nevertheless interconnected discursive registers. A World of Realms that aims to look at problematic of state formations, this mostly based on administrative literature. A World of Kings that looks at the issue of kingship, broadly thought, and that make use of advice literature and other kind of normative sources. And finally, A World of Men that look at social orders, this as described by historiography. So today I'll tackle only the first two registers and this only briefly. But before doing so, I would like first to say a few words of the context, especially the context of Islamic diplomacy. Indeed, for the longest time, it has been quite badly connoted. First and foremost, Islam's relation to the outside world is still too often seen through the lens of the Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb dichotomy. Commonly translated as a house of Islam, the concept of Dar al-Islam traditionally refers to the domain of territory in which the law of Islam prevails and in which inhabitants are guaranteed safety and protection. It is usually used together with its opposite counterpart, Dar al-Harb, the house of war, which is considered to represent the rest of the world that is not under Islamic jurisdiction and which should be fought by means by jihad. So this dichotomous pair is by many recognized as characteristic of a specific Islamic conception of the world dominated by universalistic and hostile ambition. By now, this approach has been many times questioned and nuanced, and it even appears that the relevance and success of the concept themselves may have been exaggerated by Western scholarship, as this is very well demonstrated by an entire volume on the topic edited by Giovanna Calasso, and that came out in 2018. So a reevaluation of this concept has shown that the concept of Dar in general is mostly restricted to and used by jurists, and is not to be found in any other kind of literature, such as geographical, administrative, or historiographical sources. So linked to the previous point, premodern Islamic diplomacy study has therefore mostly been focused on Muslims and non-Muslims relationships, and mostly consists of the study of truce, commercial agreements, as if the two groups have never been in contact in any other ways. More problematic even, the study of intra-Muslim relationships has greatly suffered from this general trends. And when looking at most of the scholarship indeed, the study of intra-Muslim diplomacy is also usually restricted to the study of a peace settlement of disputes, alliance making, and negotiation. We had to wait until Anne Broadbridge's 2008 study Kingship and Ideology of the Islamic and Mongol World to break free from the trend and to go beyond this restricted understanding of diplomacy. So since then, numerous studies have shown how diplomacy acted in fact as a powerful tool for legitimation, for the development of ideologies and the establishment of hierarchies. I would even say as an effective means for state formation and recognition. My own research has been increasingly going in that direction. And the volume Fred Donner mentioned, the volume Mamluk Cairo, which I've co-edited with Frederick Bodden, perfectly show, I believe, the potential of diplomacy as this analytical frame, not only then for issue of state formation, but also to look at the great diversity of actors and agents involved, or the symbolic and semiotic linked to those contacts. So be that as it may, the field of premodern Islamic diplomacy has thus shown that it has a lot to say about relation between political elites and the ways they communicated and interacted, and this beyond the settlement of dispute, the achievement of peace, and the making of alliances. In that respect, the Mamluk Sultanate has proven to be a perfect laboratory, as we possess for the period of their rule plenty of sources dealing from close or far with diplomatic contact. The prime among them are, of course, the letters that are kept in forms of copy in chancery manuals and collection of letters munshaat. Those are interesting for the content they transmit, of course, but more importantly, for what they reveal between the lines about specific dynamics, hierarchies, and hidden agendas. All those points are in fact crucial and constitute the key for understanding of this elite communication I was referring to. So how do we best understand this communication and its modalities? The dynamics between the participants, the establishment of hierarchy is what interests me the most, and in fact, much more than the letter contents themselves. It is therefore essential to combine the study of the letters with other sources, such as this advice literature, geographies, administrative handbooks, and historiography, which best provide context to this communication and the actors. So today, I'd like to address the very basis of establishment of contact between the Mamluk Sultans of Cairo and the various correspondence among the Muluk, since it seems a priori that the sending of letters, Mukatabat al-Sultaniyat, was restricted to those groups. The first part of the talk will thus address and question the concept and definition of Muluk in the framework of diplomatic contacts. Whereas the study of kingship and legitimation for the period under consideration have usually focused on Islamic character of the rule, looking at just rulers or protector of the faith and so on, or lineage, looking at Genghis Khanid or Kalaounid lineage, for example. They have too often overlooked the territorial definition of the rule and its impact in providing status and prestige. So using both geographical and administrative literature, I'd like, therefore, to make use of Zaidi Entrim's conceptual framework of discourse of place, which refers to the complex relationship between land, textuality, and authority in Islam. Indeed, in their own different though connected ways, geographic and administrative works over time have helped portraying, categorizing, and organizing the world, and thus have created territoriality. This last concept is here of prime importance as it underlines the territory as a bonded, meaningful space in relation with other territories. And it highlights territories are the products of social practices and processes, and consequently, their relations with the power that creates them. Then, in the second part of the talk, I will move to other means of legitimation used by the Muluk in order to assert their sovereignty. Indeed, as Al-Qalqashandi clearly mentioned it in his gigantic encyclopedia on the art of al-insha subh al-asha, the assertion of sovereignty is in fact the most important object of official correspondence. So to do so, I will analyze the diplomas of investitures of various Mamluk sultans, and we will see that there too, territoriality occupy a great importance. So the wall of realms. Whereas Ibn Khaldun is certainly not wrong by stating that dynasties are prior to towns and cities, and that towns and cities are secondary products of royal authority, the opposite is also correct, at least when we look at this from the perspective of diplomacy, and when we extend the geographical focus to the countries or regions in which the dynasty rules or claims to rule. Possessing a territory seems even to be a prerequisite to initiate any official contacts to adhere to a close group of correspondence. Indeed, in its, again, introduction to the letter to non-Muslim kings, the 15th century secretary Qaqashandi mentioned that all of them in this period were Christians, as the Jews did not have in their possession any known realm and were therefore no recognized correspondent. So territorial definition of the rule has too often been overlooked to the detriment of Islamic and lineage legitimation, though it appears in fact to be quite instrumental, especially in the world in which the Mamluks were living. Building upon Sarah Albrecht's concept of imaginative territory, the project looks at the discursive practice deployed through geographic and administrative works, not only to describe the world around them, but more importantly, in fact, to create territoriality. As mentioned previously, territoriality underlines a territory as a bonded, meaningful space in relationship with other territories. So unlike previous study concerned with territoriality, my focus is not much on issue of identity or belonging, nor on the people living in the lands, but instead I focus on the lands themselves and the rulers claiming power over them. The rulers were in fact often foreign elements claiming authority on a territory with which they had no previous relations or link. The territories they controlled provided them a status and a place within a broader system and within a pre-established hierarchy. In other words, it seems that territory provided rulers with a sort of symbolic capital that was essential to gain legitimation and recognition. So how the symbolic capital was expressed and communicated through various types of literature is a major concern for me here. So we possess, for such investigation, a number of relevant sources. Prime among them are the word is the category of work labeled Masalik wal Mamalik, which since André Miquel's famous study is often seen as a sort of human geography. While the genre dates back the 10th century and was always closely associated to the empire and an imperial agenda, it experienced significant change during the Mamluk period, especially with an author such as Ibn Fadala al-Umari. With this author, indeed, the concept of Mamlaka, which is usually used with al-Islam to denote Islamic empire or realm, so Mamlakat al-Islam, these terms, Mamlaka, start acquiring more specialized meaning. With al-Umari, the Mamlaka becomes clearly associated to a piece of land under the control of a political Muslim ruler. The Mamlaka thus truly connotes a political realm, and more particularly a political realm of importance, which implies an extensive territory with substantial armies and wealth and accumulation of cities. So concretely, al-Umari Masalik al-Absars lists a total of 15 of such Mamlaka, which from east to west includes the following. So we have here the list of all the realms he describes in the Masalik al-Absar. So while there will be, in fact, a lot to say about this chart, especially about the terminology, I would like instead to directly turn to al-Umari's other major work, At-Ta'rif, which more strictly deals with the correspondence and points to another reality. Indeed, al-Umari's presentation of those 15 realms above seems to imply a certain equity among the realms, and this you see here. We just have in his encyclopedia the succession of the realm, which he described on the same level. In fact, only in the introduction does the author refer to the primacy of the Mamluk rules, which consist of Egypt, Syria, and Hijaz, which is in itself quite remarkable, since in other Masalik wal Mamalik's work, those three are usually seen as separate unit. So the Ta'rif, on the contrary, not only starts with listing the correspondence among the Mamluk's realms itself, And then he entirely reversed the structure followed in the Masalik al-Absar with a presentation of the correspondent from west to east, to end, in fact, with the Christian rulers, which were remarkably, as you see here on this list of the Masalik al-Absar, not even mentioned as a Mamlaka. Finally, another striking point is that the terms Mamlaka, which is so fond of in his Masalik al-Absar, is in fact in his Tarif only applied to two realms, Turan and Iran. All the rest of the letters ought to be addressed to Sahib or Malik of the various regions or country. But Malik, again, is quite even restricted to the ruler of Takrur and Gilan, and for some Christian kings, such as the Byzantine Emperor, Georgia, or Rhodes. So this disparity among the various powers is quite obvious as well in another chancery manual, the Tathrif of Ibn Nasir al-Jaysh, another 14th century manual. And so Ibn Nasir al-Jaysh in the Tathrif is even more, in fact, specific as for the categories of the correspondence. Indeed, unlike al-Umari, Ibn Nasir al-Jaysh is very systematic in the creation of categories and the repartition of the title. Tathrif first addressed the correspondence to Muslim kings, Muluk al-Islamiyin, which only consist of Muluk al-Sharq, al-Gharb, Muluk al-Hind, al-Yemen, al-Takrur, wal-Nuba, out of which only Turan, Iran, and Tunis are considered as Mamlaka. The rest of the lands are divided between Maliks and Sahib. After his focus on the Muslim kings, Ibn Nasir al-Jaysh turned then to the Christian kings and then to all the governors and notables of the various regions that are under Islamic rules in order of importance. So going from the governors of those regions to the rulers without even a citadel, pointing therefore to a much greater plurality of the actors, but this is another topic. So whereas 14th century Mamluk chancery appears to recognize various distinctions among the correspondence that is best translated by the title, 15th century scribes move a step further in the definition of those correspondents that seems increasingly more linked to the status of the land. Indeed, from the Masalik wal-Mamalik introduction we find in Al-Qalqashandi, Subh al-Asha, and Al-Sahma with Takhl al-Basim, it is quite clear that not all lands are of the same importance, since only a few are considered as being Mamlaka, Iran, Turan, but now also Tunis and Tlemcen. The rest is being labeled either as Qatr, Balad, or Iqlim. Furthermore, the importance of the regions for the cardinal points also determines the organization of the correspondence to the king. And here is a chart of both Qalqashandi, and even more specific for later in the 15th century is a chart by As-Sahmawi. So let's now come back to the territorial definition of the rule mentioned before. Indeed, whereas Al-Umari had originally presented 15 Mamlaka in a more or less similar way, that is, as representing major political power, it seems in fact that the territory included in each Mamlaka did not grant that power the same amount of prestige, especially since very few land indeed were actually considered as representing such units. The fact that the status of the land provides status to the power claiming authority over it is obvious from the Tarif and Tathrif, especially with this association of each ruler to the territory they rule. They are Malik or Sahib, a territory. But it has become even more obvious when we look at the various chancery manuals over time and the organization. Indeed, the 15th century authors such as Qalqashandi and Sahmawi, we increasingly notice the creation of this territoriality mentioned before, with an organization of the land that best, in fact, translate their relations to Cairo. After all, Cairo was, according to Qalqashandi, the mother of all kingdoms today. Or as stated by the Sahmawi, it was the pole at the center of the realms and countries from which converge the four directions. So the possession of specific territories increasingly seems to add to the prestige of its rulers, but it was not the only thing. As clearly said by As-Sahmawi's quotation, realms and thus kings did not function alone, but were to be defined in relations with each other. This relation is well exemplified through the creation of territoriality. During the 15th century, it seems that this relation with other realms was increasingly used, in fact, as a marker of prestige as well, and thus as a new means for legitimation. This especially at a time when ideologies based on Islamic ascendancy and prestigious lineage were in decline. So the issue, and now turning to the second part of the talk, the world of king. The issue of kingship under the Mamluk Sultanate has been already well dealt with, and especially in the case of the conflict that has opposed the sultans to the Mongol Ilkhanate. And this is very obvious from Anne Broadbridge 2008's monograph. So in Kingship and Ideology, she compared Mamluks and Mongol set of ideologies and the way they materialize through the practice of diplomacy. Legitimating the rule of the Mamluk sultans represented quite a challenge in the Islamic and nomadic context. First, because of the basis of the Mamluk institution of slavery and consequently the lack of prestigious lineage and ancestors. Early on, Mamluk administration thus built up Mamluk legitimacy in strictly Islamic terms. During the 15th century, however, this Islamic discourse was progressively complemented by a new set of discourse. The process of legitimating rules, before being addressed to foreign entities, was first established back home through the ceremony of investiture. The ceremony aimed at proclaiming the elevation of the charismatic leaders at the head of the state, and it was accompanied and sanctioned by a diploma granted by the caliph, by which he handed over power to the new leader, here the sultan. So this ad, as it is called, that was read out loud during the investiture ceremony, constituted, in fact, one of the pillars of Mamluk legitimacy as set by Sultan Baybars after the Abbasid Caliphate had collapsed in Baghdad. Yeah. This had a great symbolic value. Beyond the symbolic value, the had also act as an important source, since we find in the diploma the full range of ideologies, ideals, ambitions, and program developed by each sultan. So the ad granted by the Abbasid Caliph of Cairo to the Mamluk sultans are part of the category of diplomas from the caliph to the kings. And is in encyclopedia devoted to this type of document, Al-Qalqashandi first investigated the nature of the power granted, either mulk or sultana. Al-mulk akhas min al-sultana, stated. One or the other, or both, could be in fact granted to the beneficiary, depending on his status. So historically, the act of granting an ad aimed at delegating the caliph power in the countries and region to whom he was in charge. Three categories of official could be the beneficiaries. The vizierate of delegation, the emirate freely conferred by the caliph, or the emirate taken by force or conquest. Each, in fact, corresponding to Egypt's status over time since the early Islamic conquest to the Mamluk time. So for the Mamluk Sultanate, Al-Qalqashandi finally explained that the Sultana in Egypt was in his days a combination of both Wizarat al-Tafwid and Imarat al-Istislam, that is, power between delegation and conquest. So some of these diplomas have been kept in chancery manuals and collection of letters such as Al-Qalqashandi Subh al-Asha and Ibn Hijaz Qahwat al-Insha. So the first kept copy of diploma granted to Zahir Baybars, Mansour Qalawun, Kitbura, Lajin, Al-Nasir Mohammed ibn Qalawun, Baybars al-Mansouri, and Muayyad Sheikh, so are kept in Al-Qalqashandi, and Ibn Hijaz has kept the diplomas to Tatar and Barsbey. Both of them have also kept the diploma that has been ever granted to the Sultan of Delhi, Muzaffar Shah. So I won't be able, of course, to present all the detail of each diploma, nor the rules of writing such a document, but rather I will provide a couple of summary of the diplomas in a couple of slides. So the diploma granted to the sultans in the 13th, 14th century built up on what Nicola di Cosmo referred to as an ideology in reserve, for which you find here the definition. As part of this ideology in reserve was a reference to the notion of Islamic empire, unified under the rule of the Abbasid Caliph. The Abbasid Caliphate of Cairo was inaugurated by the first Sultan Baybars in 1261, that ought to expand to the detriment of the infidels. In this context, the Mamluks emerged as the major actor through which that ideal could be made possible. The Sultan was fashioned then as guardian of Islam, mujahid par excellence, protector of the holy cities, and as legitimate heir of the Ayyubids. So these notions are all found in the first group of diploma kept for the 13th and 14th century. Oops, went too fast. Yes, here it is. So originally, the power granted by the Caliph to the Sultan Baybars and Kalawun were those related to the comment of the community. But as from Kitbura, were also given those related to Hukm, Mulk, and Sultana. When looking at the details of the powers and duties, they were of true Islamic nature. Preservation of the religion according to its principle and the consensus of the community, execution of the law, correction of the wrongs, protection of the good and prevention of the wrong, execution of the hudud, protection of the frontiers, jihad against the enemies of Islam, raising tax, evaluation of gift and donation, managing the money of the treasury, pilgrimage and protection of the holy cities. Throughout all this example, one noticed, however, a great focus always on justice and jihad, especially that against the Armenians, the Franks, and the Mongol. As from the 15th century, however, had writing take another turn. For Al-Khalkhashandi to notice that the diploma granted to Al-Muayyad Sheikh was quite uncommon, full of ajaib and kharaib. So if that author first and foremost, in fact, refer here to the style, a reading of the ad itself also shows a new discourse and new features. The diploma, in fact, starts with a long introduction blaming previous rules and tyranny, and praise God for his intervention in return of a just rule. Then it goes on with a recognition of Al-Muayyad Sheikh's greatness, first by those who have the supreme rule among the Muslim kings and the emirs, the judge and scholars, and only in second place by the caliph. This shift in the place of the caliph regarding the handing over of the power is also well attested in the last two samples of diploma to Tatar and Barzbey. So while Sheikh's diploma still mention Islamic duties, such as, for example, the execution of the law, justice, fadl, commanding the right and forbidding the wrong, which is in fact the first time this is ever mentioned in one of those diplomas, but also the execution of hudud, control of the subject, protection of fortress and frontiers, control of the governors, mention of the Juyush al-Islam and Juyush al-Bahr, the need for the maintenance of the holy cities and the reopening of the pilgrimage road after the destruction by Tourmaline, which is here even mentioned by name, and the other, so this is for Muayyad Sheikh's diploma, the other two samples barely mention any Islamic related duties, save for the karam, the deen, and the aql. So one should also notice that the duty for jihad is ignored as such. Only in Muayyad Sheikh we find this reference to the Juyush al-Islam, but the jihad disappear altogether from the diplomas. So instead, a new feature is increasingly present. The mention of foreign rulers either setting themselves under a sultan's command, such as Muluk al-Rum, al-Hind, wal-Habsha, presented as Mamluk and servant of the Mamluk Sultanate Tatar's diploma, or praising and celebrating the Sultan's rules and its place in the world, in ala rutba min muluk al-ard wa ashraf, such as it is mentioned in Barzbey's diploma. So the latter is even more specific as for the identity of all those foreign kings praising him. They are none other than the rulers of India, of Yemen, Iraq, Iran, and China. It is worth mentioning here that in the case of Yemen, Iraq, and Iran, the diplomat does not mention the land, but the name of their rulers, El-Nasir, El-Iskandar, and Shah Rukh, which is, again, quite unusual in such formal documents. Then, in Barzbey diploma, comes also the mention of other rulers fearing Barzbey's power, such as Ethiopia, Sudan, Takrur, and Nubia. So whereas the Mamluk sultans had first been able to assert the basis of their rule and legitimacy through the use of this ideology in reserve based on Islamic value, among which jihad against the infidel held the highest position, it seems that by the 15th century, this ideology did not suffice anymore for their internal audience. The value of jihad progressively was replaced by the use of diplomacy, here to be understood as the communication between political power. So one can, of course, doubt of the reality of those claims, that is, that the rulers of Rome, India, Iran, and China had actually sent letters praising the Sultan, or at least at this early stage of their rule. What is, in my view, more important is that the use of that claim seemed to become a gauge of the legitimacy. In other words, diplomacy in the 15th century becomes an attribute of kingship, and foreign rulers' recognition was an essential aspect of it. So to conclude, if the possession of a land, hopefully a prestigious one, was a first step in the elevation to kingship, the formal recognition by one's peers was as important. In this context, the establishment of territoriality as set in administrative work is the key for understanding the dynamic of this race to recognition. To who should one send an accession letter, and from whom should it receive a congratulation? Maybe a coincidence, but collection of letters dating from the 15th century kept more and more copies of letter of succession sent to foreign rulers. Whereas this category of letters was originally meant to an internal audience, so to be sent to governors and subjects, the sample preserved showed that in fact Mamluk Sultan in the 15th century actually were more active in that direction and felt more the need for formal recognition. The Kahwat al-Insha, for example, kept none other than 4 letters, accession letters of Muayyad Sheikh himself, sent to Tunis, to Yemen, and to 2 different rulers in Tehran. Among the best known illustration of this issue is, for example, the dispute also that took place between Sultan Khushqadam and the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II. Not only were there grave infringement in the diplomatic protocol during the reception of Cairo, but at the basis of the issue was that no letter of congratulation were sent on the accession of Khushqadam to the throne. Such cases are also known during the reign of Sultan Inaus, for example, who had strongly complained to the Karako eunuch Jahan Shah for not sending a letter for his accession to the throne in 1456. But besides those famous cases, there were many examples attested, in fact, in copies of letters, which involved not only Mamluk sultans, but also Timurid and Turkmen correspondents, either in power or pretending to, which all attest to this desperate need to be recognized and hopefully elevated to the status of kings. Thank you very much.